They say she rode in on a pale horse like some kind of ghost bride, white lace dress billowing in the wind, veil stained with trail dust and dried blood. No saddle, no bags, just a Colt 45 strapped under layers of silk town. Folks stopped dead where they stood, mouths agape, breath caught like they were seeing an omen. She dismounted slow, like she had all the time in the world, and when she looked up, she didn't look around, she looked straight at the sheriff. And that's when his hand twitched, the air turned heavier than thunder clouds, you could hear a pin drop, or the ticking of a clock that just ran out. Sheriff Billon hadn't flinched in 17 years, not since he dragged 2 rustlers out of the creek and hanged them from the sycamore, but when he saw her, his eyes dropped to the telegram crumpled in his coat pocket, and his lips whispered a name none of us had heard in years. Eli's girl. But Eli was dead, had been for 3 days, shot clean through the heart on the morning of his wedding. Sheriff claimed it was a robbery gone bad, but no one ever found the robber, no one but her. And now she was here, still in her wedding dress, still wearing his ring around her neck, still smelling faintly of funeral lilies and gunpowder. We hadn't seen her in town before, didn't know her folks, but the way she stared down the lawman, you'd think she was his judge and jury. She didn't cry, didn't ask questions, didn't even blink. She just walked past us all, right into the church where the body still lay in the pine wood coffin. And that's when we heard the scream, not hers, not his, the sheriff's. The church hadn't seen a crowd in months, not since Preacher Colin drank himself out of grace and into the grave, but that morning it held 2 things, too holy and too cursed for words: a coffin with Eli Braith's body inside, and the woman who once promised to be his bride. She walked right up to that box without hesitation, like she already knew how he looked, knew the shape of his death. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor like pistol shots. Then she leaned in close, real close, and whispered something into the pine lid. I was standing just outside the doorway watching from behind a pillar. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her fingers. They traced the grain of the wood like it was a lover's face, then stopped at the bullet hole over his heart. Her white glove came away red. That coffin wasn't sealed. The sheriff burst through the doors, then breathless and pale, hat in hand, gun at his side. He looked like a man who knew Judgment Day had come early. "What are you doing here?" he asked, her voice tight. She turned slow as the sun on a dry July morning, finishing what you started. No one breathed. Sheriff's hand went for the telegram in his pocket again, but she already had it. Don't ask me how 1 minute it was his. Next minute it was in her gloved hand, held up for all to see. The telegram read, "Groom found dead bride, missing. Sheriff reports no leads," but underneath, scribbled in a second hand, faint like someone wrote it from a sickbed or worse, was a single line: "If she comes back, don't let her speak." The room tilted on its axis. Right then, I swear it. Like the church had turned into a courtroom, and we were the damned jury. She looked around at all of us, then back at the sheriff. "Tell them what you did, Billon, or I will." His hand trembled. And right then, a baby cried somewhere in the back pews. An old woman crossed herself, and the sun outside had vanished behind a cloud like even God didn't want to watch. They say every man carries 2 stories, the one he tells, and the one that follows him like a shadow. Sheriff Billon had told his story too many times, but now the shadow was catching up. He took a step back, hand still hovering near his holster, not to draw, not yet, but the weight of guilt can be heavier than iron. "You got no proof," he muttered. "Ain't no court in this county would take the word of a woman who ran off the night her fiancé died." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I didn't run, I was chased. That's when the doors creaked behind me. 3 more figures stepped inside, older men, quiet eyes like cracked leather ranchers, ex-deputies, even one old drunk we all thought was too blind to shoot. But they weren't looking at her, they were looking at the sheriff. One of them, Hank Delmer, spoke first. "She came to me 2 nights ago, showed me the letter Eli wrote the day before he died." A hush fell. He knew, Hank said, knew someone was gunning for him. Said if anything happened, don't trust the law. And then she pulled it out, a folded piece of paper, smudged and yellowed, ink faded, but the words carved like stone. "Billon wants the land. He found out about the deed transfer. If him gone, he gets it. If you're reading this, I am dead. Marry her anyway." My chest locked up tight, because I remembered what happened after the gunshot. How the sheriff never let her near the body, said it was best she stay gone. That grief made folks do strange things. But now we saw what was stranger, the truth. Sheriff Billon had wanted Ellis Ranch, the one with the spring beneath it, land that could feed cattle when others dried up. He knew the wedding meant the land was being transferred to her name, and so the groom had to die before the ink dried. What he didn't count on was that she'd survive. "You were supposed to be on our side," she said. "Instead you put the bullet in him or stood by while someone else did." The sheriff's lips trembled. "You don't know what it was like," he whispered. "I gave everything to this town. And what did Eli do? He was going to give the water away, give it to ranchers who couldn't pay, let his woman take over like she knew the land. He didn't think it was his he thought it was ours." She looked at him then, not with hate, not even rage, just sorrow, the kind that bends a woman but don't break her. And then she said, "You didn't just kill a man, you killed a marriage before it began. You buried a promise." The sheriff finally drew his gun, but not to shoot her. He turned it on himself, and before anyone could speak, he lowered it again. The sheriff's hand lowered slow, like the weight of his own gun had suddenly gotten too heavy to bear. He looked older than he ever had, like every lie he ever told was etched into the lines of his face. But before he could speak another word, the woman in white, Ellis Bride, reached into her dress. We all tensed. I reckon half the men there thought she'd pull steel, but what she brought out instead was a small velvet pouch, and from it she dropped something onto the floorboards. Clink. A second bullet, not fired, still whole, but carved with initials. E.B. Eli Braith's bullet, the one he never got to fire. She turned to us, her eyes sweeping the room like a judge weighing sins. Eli knew someone was coming for him, so he made a single bullet just in case he didn't, to make it to the altar. But I found another bullet in the wall behind our cabin. A second bullet that didn't come from a robber. The room turned to ice, the only man still leaning against the far post, tall with a scar under his chin and boots too clean for a drifter, shifted. And that's when I saw her eyes snap to him. Cold and steady, she said, "You were at the cabin, weren't you?" "Un maison bonheur. Chez was I." The man stood up straighter. Didn't he deny it? Didn't speak. The sheriff glanced back, now looking like a man who just remembered where he'd buried something awful. "His name? Creed," the sheriff said finally. "He used to ride for me back in the war." "He pulled the trigger," she said, "and I cleaned it up." The truth finally stood naked in front of us all. Eli hadn't been killed by a stranger. He'd been hunted by the man hired to protect him and sold out by the badge he trusted. The man called Creed didn't move, didn't blink, until she said one final thing. "I came back to bury the past, but maybe it's the past that needs to bury you." And just like that, Creed lunged, but before his hand could reach for steel, a gunshot rang out through the church. Not hers, not the sheriff's. Hank Delmer, the oldest among us, was holding a smoking pistol. Eli was like a son to me. Creed dropped, dead before he hit the floor. No one moved for a long moment. The only sound was the wind outside and the quiet clicking of her boots as she walked to the coffin. She rested the second bullet beside him, whispered something none of us heard, then turned toward the door. She walked back out into the sunlight like she'd come through a storm and left thunder in her wake. The townsfolk outside hadn't moved. Word travels fast in places like Barrow Hollow, and they were already gathered in silence. They waited to see how this strange tale would end. Only it hadn't ended, not yet. We thought she came for justice, but she came for something else too. Closure. At the edge of town stood an old ash tree. Used to be where couples carved their initials, swore promises, and kissed under its shade. That's where she went. She lit a fire there. Small, controlled, but burning hotter than anything I'd seen in years. From her saddlebag she took two things: Eli's coat and a marriage license signed in ink that hadn't even dried the day he died. She folded both and set them in the flame, watched them curl and blacken, watched the life she was promised vanish into smoke. And then she took off the dress. Underneath was a plain riding shirt and trousers, no lace, no veil, no sign she'd ever worn a wedding gown. The white dress went into the fire next. She said goodbye not with tears but with fire. The wind caught ashes and flung them high, and I swear for a moment it looked like snow falling in summer. She stood there alone watching it all disappear, and when the fire died down to embers, he turned, looked back toward the town one last time. The sheriff hadn't followed her. He stayed inside the church, sitting beside the coffin, like a man waiting to be judged by ghosts. But she'd already judged him, and maybe worse. She'd let him live with what he'd done. Sometimes mercy cuts deeper than a bullet. She rode out of town just past sundown. No saddlebag, no rifle, just a locket around her neck, and a road that disappeared into the horizon. And that we thought was the end of it. But Barrow Hollow don't forget easy, and neither do ghosts. 3 nights after she disappeared over the ridgeline, a stable boy named Simon found a box buried beneath the pulpit floorboards of the old church. It was wrapped in oilskin, tucked behind loose planks. No one thought to check before. He'd gone down there chasing a mouse. What he dragged out instead was a box of letters sealed in gilt and dust. There were dozens, some written to Banks in Abilene, some to a woman named Cora in Tombstone, and one, just one, written in the same hand but addressed to no one. A letter that read more like a man writing to his conscience than to a soul who could answer. The words were jagged, hesitant, like every line was written through clenched teeth. It said he'd watched Eli grow up like a son that he trusted too much, that the land was too valuable to fall into the hands of a woman who'd give it away. That kindness had no place in a town clinging to survival. But the line that hit hardest was near the bottom. He hadn't meant for the boy to die. That was all it said, simple, cold, and maybe true. The letter passed through Laurel Sands next. The schoolteacher, she didn't cry when she read it. Just folded it with the care you'd give a confession before burning it. No one said a word at first, because the truth didn't roar, it whispered. And that whisper cut deeper than any bullet. The sheriff hadn't left the church since the day of the burial. He slept there, ate there, sat with the pews like they were old friends who'd finally seen through him. They say he read the letter 3 times, folded it once, then walked outside and left his badge on the front step of the church, glinting in a streak of light no one had noticed until then. He didn't speak, did run. He just walked west, hat low, shoulders heavy, and the sky over Barrow Hollow suddenly feeling too wide. Some say he threw himself into the river. Others swear he made it to the border and started fresh. But I think he just went out looking for a place where his name didn't follow him like smoke. Justice didn't come from a court that week. There was no trial, no gallows, just a woman in a wedding dress who walked into a town of lies and left it stripped to the bone. We thought it ended with her riding off and the sheriff vanishing like a ghost ashamed of its own shadow. But the thing about ghosts is they don't leave until they've said their last word. A week after the funeral, the banker from Dry Creek showed up. He was a thin man with slick hair and a ledger tucked under his arm, like it held the secrets of every soul west of the Mississippi. Said he was looking for next of kin, not out of sentiment, just business. Eli Braith had signed papers before his death transferring the ranch into both their names, but only one of them was still breathing. The banker laid the ledger down on the saloon bar and pointed at the signature. Clear as day, 2 names joined in ink. One of the old ranch hands leaned over, saw what was written in the margin. A note scrawled in the corner in Eli's unmistakable hand. It said, "If I don't make it to the altar, she owns the water. She's the one who'll know what to do with it." That changed everything. Because Ellis land wasn't just pasture, it had the only fresh spring for 40 miles, and now that land belonged to the woman in the wedding dress, wherever she was. Most folks would have sold it off, taken the money, and vanished into some distant city, but she didn't. 3 days later a wagon arrived, unmarked, quiet, driven by a pair of Mexican ranchers none of us recognized. They came with a letter sealed in wax and handed it to Hank Delmer without saying a word. He opened it by lantern light and read it so slow you'd think he was carving each word into his bones. She hadn't left the territory, hadn't run. She had gone east toward a strip of land where the old orphan line sat abandoned, a place that used to be a shelter for war widows and half-starved children after the fires of '63. And that's where she was headed. She gave the land, every acre of it, to the women and children whose names never made it into any ledgers. No charge, no conditions, just a single sentence at the bottom of the letter. This water don't belong to men who kill to own it, it belongs to the ones who survived them. No one in town spoke for a long time after that. The bar went silent, the cards lay untouched, even the piano went still like the keys themselves couldn't carry that kind of truth. She hadn't come back to collect vengeance or property. She came back to finish a promise. One that started with love and ended in justice. But the story wasn't done, not yet. Because the last thing that wagon carried tucked behind a sack of grain was a locket. It was left in the banker's hands with a note. Inside the locket a tiny drawing. Not of Eli, but of a child, eyes too big for its face, smile like sunlight on cold stone. The kind of smile you only draw when you've met it. The locket was passed from hand to hand like it might burn whoever held it too long. No inscription. No name, just that sketch, a child no older than 4, with wild curls and a lopsided grin drawn in pencil, with the kind of care you don't waste on strangers. The question hung in the air, heavier than thunder. Whose child was it? No one knew, not for sure. But the whispers started soon after that. Maybe Eli had known that maybe she hadn't just lost a groom that day. Maybe she'd lost a father for a child the town never got the chance to meet. Some remembered how Shed held her stomach when she arrived, real gentle-like, when she thought no one was watching. Others recalled that Eli had been in a hurry to marry, rushed the ceremony, skipped the invitations, went straight to the preacher with only a ring and a witness. It all made sense now. She wasn't just coming back for vengeance or justice, she was coming back to secure something far more fragile, a future, a name, a piece of Eli that still lived. And she'd done it quietly, with fire and grit, not bullets. She never said the child's name, never confirmed it with ink or voice, but she didn't need to. The locket said enough. After that, something shifted in Barrow Hollow. The town didn't speak ill of her anymore, didn't whisper in doorways, or raise their brows at the sound of wedding Lacey. In fact, the schoolhouse got a fresh coat of paint, the preacher's bench got mended, and a spring-fed trough was built in the center of town with a hand-carved sign over it, for the ones they tried to forget. The sheriff's badge still sat where he left it. No one touched it. It stayed right there on the church step until the rains came and washed it clean. No one ever picked it up again, and in the years that followed, the Braithland, now known only as the widow's gift, became a safe haven. For the abandoned, the orphaned, the ones run off by men with power and too little heart. No one knew exactly where she was, but every spring someone found fresh lilies blooming by Ella's old grave, tied in twine, silent, pure, and every time there'd be a second bloom laid next to it. Smaller, newer, as if someone was laying down flowers for 2. For a while it felt like peace had finally taken root in Barrow Hollow. The spring ran clear, the ranchers stopped fighting, and the name Braith became something folks said with a quiet kind of respect. Not out loud, but in the way they looked toward the horizon when the sun went down. Then, one evening, just before frost took the last of the leaves, a stranger rode into town. No coat, no name, no dust on his boots. He didn't stop at the saloon, didn't tie up his horse. He went straight to the church, where the pews still smelled faintly of cedar and regret. He stood at the altar like he'd been there before, like he remembered the echo of a coffin closing, and when someone asked if he needed help, he just said 5 words. I came for the widow, except no one had seen her in over a year. The name he gave, if you could call it that, was Crowley. Said he worked land out past Devil's Ridge near the canyon trail, but his hands were too soft, his eyes too sharp. Not a rancher, not a traveler, more like a man who followed secrets for a living. He asked questions not just about her, about Eli, about the sheriff, about the fire she lit, and the deed she signed, about the locket, and who might have drawn the picture inside it. And that's when we knew he wasn't just passing through, he was digging. He even rode out to the Braithland himself, didn't stay long, but when he came back, something had changed in his face. Like he'd seen a ghost or worse, like he hadn't seen one and expected to. He claimed she was hiding something, said the land had been bought too clean, the paperwork too perfect, said no woman rides into a town in a wedding dress, buries a man, burns her own name, and rides off without leaving something behind. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that she left behind the truth. and that truth had already rewritten the soil. Still he kept poking, and when folks stopped answering, he didn't ask again. He just started watching the saloon, the post, even the church, like he was waiting for her shadow to show back up. But the thing about a woman like her, she dawn't test a shadow unless she wants to. And when she does, you best pray you're standing on the right side of it. Crowley wasn't just curious, he was patient. Too patient for a man with no stake in the land. And when someone watches that long, without blinking, they ain't gathering gossip. They were gathering targets. He started sending telegrams, short ones, coded. The clerk said the wires went east, same direction she'd gone. The air in town shifted again, not like a storm, more like a sickness coming back and slow. Then one morning Hank Delmer went missing. His door was wide open, lantern still burning, chair tipped like he'd gotten up in a hurry, or been pulled from it. Folks searched, of course, scoured the creek, checked the tree line, rode out toward the widow's gift. But all they found was Hank's hat hung neatly on the post just outside the church, and a scrap of paper pinned beneath it. The land was never yours to give. That was Crowley's doing. It wasn't written in his hand, but it stank of his teeth. Whatever he was here to find, he thought it was still buried, and Hank had the shovel. People stopped speaking to him after that. The storekeep turned him away. The stable refused his horse water. But Crowley didn't care. He wasn't afraid of being unwelcome. He was afraid of time. He knew she'd be back. You could see it in the way he watched the horizon each dusk. Not like he was hoping for her return, but bracing for it. And then came the night someone saw her silhouette on the ridge. She didn't ride into town, didn't light a fire, didn't say a word. She just stood there, long enough for her shape to be seen by every man who'd once doubted her. Long enough for Crowley to know the past had found him. He left his room that night with a rifle, didn't come back with it. But the next morning the church bell rang. Not for a sermon, not for a funeral. It rang once, then stopped. And in front of the doors, folded like an offering, was the locket, the one with the child's face inside, except now the drawing was gone. The page torn out clean, and in its place just a single strip of paper. Don't come looking again. No one heard the shot. If there was one, it was swallowed by the hills or caught in the throat of the wind that swept across the ridge that night. All we know is this. By dawn, Crowley's horse came back without him. Saddle stained, one stirrup torn. Not panicked. Just tired, like it had carried a man toward a reckoning and returned lighter than it left. We looked. Of course we did. Search parties fanned out from Barrow Hollow to Widow's Gift. They found a boot print half faded in the mud, a torn scrap of dark wool clinging to a thorn bush, and a broken branch near the creek where the ground never fully dries. But no body, no rifle, no Crowley, and no sign of her, at least not until we saw what had been left on the ridge. A single stone, smooth, set upright like a marker, carved into it simple as a prayer. Some debts can't be collected. That stone's still up there high above the town. You can see it on clear mornings if you squint through the mist. Some say it's a warning. Others say it's a grave. But the truth is, none of us really wanted to know. Because whatever happened between her and Crowley that night, it didn't belong to the rest of us. It was personal, final, done. Barrow Hollow didn't speak his name after that. And for once the silence wasn't out of fear, but respect. That ridge stayed quiet. Even the birds flew around it. And every spring when the flowers bloom, there's always one patch of wild violets near that stone. No one plants them. They just grow, like something remembering her. Or maybe protecting what she left behind. The years passed. Barrow Hollow changed, but not loud and fast like some places do. It softened. Some fences were mended. The land stayed dry most summers, but the widow's gift never ran out of water. Children grew up not knowing the full story, only pieces. The woman in white. The dead groom. The sheriff who vanished into dust. Most thought it was legend until they saw the spring, until they drank from it, and felt something deeper than water run through them. No one ever built a house on the ridge. That ground stayed wild, sacred in a way even the law respected. And every year someone, maybe her, maybe someone she trusted, left lilies at Ellis' grave, always too. Sometimes there was a letter, sometimes just silence, but the grave never looked forgotten. It said that once during a hard winter a boy wandered too far from the orphan homestead and got caught in a snow squall. He said a woman found him near the old fence line, wrapped him in a coat too fine for the cold, held him till the wind passed. When they found him, he was warm and safe, still clutching a silver locket. He couldn't describe her face, said it was like trying to remember a dream, but he remembered her voice. She told him, "Don't be afraid, some ghosts come back to guard, not haunt. Sometimes at night when the wind howls through the gulch, it sounds like spurs against stone, like the whisper of a veil, like the promise of something left unfinished, finally finding its end." She was never seen again, not by name, not by face, but her story stayed. Not because it was written, not because it was carved in stone, but because the town remembered. They remembered the woman who walked into a funeral wearing a wedding dress, who lit a fire without lifting a gun, who turned vengeance into something stronger than fear. Truthu, the girl they called the bride of the dead, she became something more. A guardian, a storm in lace, a whisper on the ridge. So if you ever ride through Barrow Hollow, tip your hat when you pass the old church, drink from the spring, but do it with respect. And if the wind shifts sudden, and you smell lilies on the air, you might want to ride on fast, because not every story buried in that town stays dead.